Hi, this is Andy Chu. Today I'm here with Lisa Koshkarian, Ph.D. Lisa is a clinical psychologist with over 30 years of experience. And we are here today to dive into the world of PTSD. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Andy. It's good to be here with you today.
So PTSD fascinates me. When I was a child, there was a fire in my house. It was an old house and there was no fire alarm. But I remember my sister-in-law yelling, "Fire, fire!" And I jumped out of bed and ran out of the house in my pajamas. Soon the house went up in flames. For at least a year after that, every time I felt heat, I became frightened. What's interesting here is that during the fire, I didn't actually feel any heat because I got out so quickly. A few days ago, I read an article by a psychologist who said that people can get PTSD just from watching the Capitol riot on TV. This reminds me of my house fire, where I didn't see, feel, smell any fire. But the idea of being in danger haunted me. In the case of the riot, people saw it on TV, but they were not in physical danger. Yet they can still get traumatized. So these two incidents suggest to me that PTSD has a lot to do with the idea of being in danger and not just the perception of danger with our senses. What do you think, Lisa?
Absolutely. I think that anybody who has experienced any type of overwhelming, emotionally traumatic event can be re-triggered by any kind of stimuli, whether it's visual, olfactory, or any other kind of sensorial kind of discerning of that stimuli. It can be their symptoms of the trauma, their fears and their anxiety can become more acute in the moment that they are re-experiencing stimuli associated with that event. And that can also include nightmares. It can include, even having a nightmare. They can re-experience all of the symptoms of that they experienced in the original event of the trauma. So watching the Capitol riots could very well re-trigger people who have experienced or witnessed any version of violence, or a threat to their life or a threat to their loved ones' lives.
So you're saying that the PTSD for many folks don't actually start at the riot. It is actually a trigger for things that have happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. I think that people who are present at the riots certainly could have been and were traumatized. I think that for people who watched the riot on television or even heard about it or read about it, most likely if they are experiencing symptoms of trauma, it's because they're being re-triggered and they're re-experiencing based on a past experience of trauma.
So at what point do you think people should seek help?
That's a really good question. I think that a person who's been re-triggered with PTSD symptoms, just by nature of the circumstance, has been living with PTSD symptoms for, as long as the original trauma occurred. So it could be months, years that they've been living with this. And so it's always a judgment call when those symptoms get reactivated as to, okay, is it time to, sort of intensify my seeking of help and receiving of help. I guess I would think of maybe one helpful measurement tool is what is the functional impairment. So for people who are then re-experiencing repeated nightmares that last, more than a couple of weeks, let's say, which is interfering with their sleep and therefore interfering with their concentration and all the other faculties that people need in order to feel safe going about their daily life, but also being able to attend to work. Is there heightened arousal happening multiple times a day? Meaning like they're having kind of like a jump scare or a memory or an avoidance of or a fearful response or avoidance of kind of daily stimuli that's causing them to be unable to focus for the most parts on the things they need to be focusing on. I think that if they're starting to experience a more acute, series of symptoms like that that are functionally impairing them, then it's definitely time to get help.
Is it possible for people to have PTSD and don't even know they have it?
That's another
So, for
good question.
example, I had a client who survived the Cambodian genocide. She was a Chinese woman. And she would have these very strange dreams that she didn't know the meaning of, but they would terrify her. So her therapist thought that those nightmares came from the traumatic event, but those dreams have nothing to do, at least facially, have anything to do with the traumatic event. So is it possible for people to be traumatized and not know it?
I think, Andy, that's a great example because I think, first of all, depending on a person's cultural or, kind of country of origin background, these kinds of symptoms and experiences may be defined differently, differentially, just depending on where a person is from. Depending on what a person's background is, they may or may not have crossed paths with anyone who had ever defined their symptoms as problematic. They may just feel like, oh, this is just me. This is just my life. This is just, people from my background don't
Right.
complain about these things, or we don't seek help for these sorts of things. This is just something I have to deal with. So I think there's, for those reasons, I think there are countless people who wouldn't even consider that they have any kind of disorder going on. And then there's people who maybe do live within cultures where PTSD is a thing and is something that is maybe widely discussed. But I think sometimes people just don't realize a light bulb doesn't go off for them unless they have somebody to validate their experience. And then it kind of brings it all together. I think it can be also sort of threatening in a way. It can be kind of scary to think that they might be walking around with a disorder. They'd almost rather just grin and bear it and just sort of buckle down and plow through life because they don't want their lives to be further disrupted. So they might even avoid going to get help or getting a diagnosis. But then once they do, I think people generally feel very relieved. They feel like, oh, there's validity to what I'm experiencing, and it's real, and it's universally distressing, and I'm not all alone with this. So I
So
think that, go ahead.
what makes something a disorder? As opposed to, oh, this is just something that haunts me and I deal with it and I go on with my life. What makes a memory, a set of feelings, a disorder?
Well, it's kind of like a similar criteria. It depends on what criteria you're using. I mean, I feel like a person's subjective experience of distress over time is enough to legitimize a person's experience of distress. But technically, a disorder is similar to the criteria that is used in the medical profession, which is that, in the mental health profession, we have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which describes different quote unquote disorders, which have a consistent set of symptoms and experiences that a person could even look at themselves and say, oh, do I have 8 out of those 12? And have I had them for the amount of period of time that people with this disorder have? And I'm not suggesting people should self-diagnose. I'm just saying that there is an objective way to validate and verify that a person has a mental health disorder.
I was diagnosed with depression when I was in law school. And before being diagnosed, I was just moody.
Ah,
But once I was diagnosed, now I have a system to support me, right? I have my therapist, I have my psychiatrist to monitor the meds. I have this whole literature of studies to validate. So to me, it's so important to seek help, to seek treatment, because you don't want to just be, out there alone, feeling alone. Now, a lot of PTSD literature that I read talks about this one life-threatening event, right?
Yeah.
But racism can also be life-threatening. I mean, look at African Americans in our society. I heard that driving black is a is a crime, right?
Yes.
Driving while black. So,
Yeah.
can racism actually be a trigger or a cause for PTSD? What do you think?
Yes. I totally agree with that, and um, I think that you help establish an idea that we can move beyond more traditional ideas about what can constitute trauma. And I think that in different contexts, that trauma can show up all sorts of ways. And I think it's often the population themselves who can help highlight and sort of validate, no, we actually have the experience of going out and our lives being threatened every single day. And so, yes, you specifically said, can it be the cause of retriggering or as a primary trauma? And I think those kinds of experiences can absolutely be both. For example, an experience of repeated discrimination, repeated rejection based on what one's physical appearance is, that is rejected by the person, the surrounding community, let's say. I think that can be traumatic because it can lead a person to feel like, can I even succeed? Can I even support myself? Will I get a job that I can keep because I keep being discriminated against, or I keep being treated unfairly, or people keep looking at me in a way like, like I've come from, some other planet or something, instead of being part of, that sort of outsider feeling. Marginalization can certainly be traumatic.
And that's what's happening with Asian Americans when they are blamed for the COVID.
Yes, that's another very, very current and relevant example of anyone who is Asian or Asian American or looks Asian or Asian American. If they're, if they're at all kind of paying attention to how they're being treated, they're, unless they block it all out. And even if you do block it out, even if you do sort of like, I just got to go about my business and not pay attention to what people are, how people are responding to me, it's still there. And that threat is real. And people read news stories and hear about people being verbally and physically attacked just as a result of being or looking Asian. And that is traumatic.
One thing I read about trauma is this idea called post-traumatic growth. So the idea is positive psychological change experienced as a result of adversity and other challenges in order to rise to a higher level of functioning. Um,
Hmm.
Post-traumatic growth involves life-changing psychological shifts in thinking and relating to the world that contribute to a personal process of change that's deeply meaningful. And I was like, wow. So, how could we encourage these positive changes and minimize the negative? And should
Hmm.
we? Because is there actually actual value for the mind to relive the terror?
Um, I think that I think it's a really potentially very useful positive reframe on traumatic experiences. The only caveat I would say is that some people just don't feel capable of using their trauma as a positive experience. One has to be careful how they talk about it. Uh, there are many who would feel like there's just absolutely no way I'm going to ever think of this as positive. And of course, what you suggested there and what you shared isn't about saying, oh, the traumatic event was positive. No, that it's never positive to go through trauma.
Mm.
But it's sort of like if somebody comes in and like pulls everything out of your closet and throws it all on the floor, and you're really irritated and upset, and you're like, I'll never be able to, put it all back together. And I think what you just described is the idea that, okay, well, let's take this as an opportunity. All right, something terrible has happened and you're feeling distress about it, but maybe we can put things back together in a way that's even stronger and more highly organized, and that will fortify you for future life challenges. so that you feel more equipped the next time you either feel triggered or something upsetting happens, that you'll be in a better position to cope with it.
I had a flood in my house, and it destroyed some of my carpet. It was very stressful because, the renovation people have to be in my house for 3-4 days, canceling in and out. We have to remove a lot of furniture and things. But one good thing came out of it was that it required me to change the old carpet. But
I like that example. And of course, you would say, I wish this never happened. It's not like you're saying, oh, I'm so glad this flood happened because then I
yeah,
had
I'm
to get
so
new
glad.
carpet. That's not the idea, but it's more like, okay, this did happen. It's first of all accepting. It's sort of like this going through the stages of grief. I think that accepting trauma or accepting a distressing event requires a person to some extent to go through some of the stages of grief, and that includes acceptance, which is what you did. You said, "Okay, this happened, and now I can perhaps, instead of kind of wallowing in what a unfortunate situation this is, I can see it as an opportunity to make things better."
How would someone reframe the Capitol riot?
Okay, that's a good question. I think an example of reframing it is once again acknowledging this is horrific. This is deeply disturbing, very, very, very upsetting. And one reframe would be, and I need to accept that Americans are more enraged and more violently distressed about their political positions than I realized, which I think is what one of the shocking parts of the Capitol riots. I think that people also thought that our government was somehow invulnerable, that our democracy was invulnerable, and I think to reframe it is to say, all right, I didn't realize this. I didn't realize how vulnerable we were. And I didn't realize that even like on a physical level that the Capitol building could be stormed in this way. And the opportunity here is to kind of update one's idea about reality, about current socio-political cultural reality. And I think when people are more equipped with the current realities, they're in a much better position to figure out, well, how am I going to cope with this then? Because then they know what they're dealing with. Like, oh, now I know. Now I realize what the situation is. Maybe they do like one of the things I've been doing is a lot of background reading and just sort of how did this all, what is the history of this rage and organizations that support these kinds of uprisings and I chose my readings, but people might choose any array of readings or material that will help fortify or help them understand better how these sorts of things happen. I think that when a person gets a greater sense of mastery, even in the context of just understanding something better, they can feel a bit calmer about it. So that's one way I would think
Yeah,
about reframing.
I think that's a great way. I think that's a great way because you're saying, at least to me, you're saying, yes, it was a horrible event, but it also prompts us to learn more about other people with different opinions. I think to me that understanding is so important. I remember one time I was in a bakery when we were still going to offices.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked for a particular chocolate cookie in the glass case, and the baker, the woman said, "Oh, why do you want that one?" And I said, "Well, because that one looks most fresh. I want the freshest cookie." And she became unhappy. I could see her face darkened. And instead of feeling like instead of me feeling put off or unhappy, I asked, "What's going on? Does it bother you that I asked for that cookie?" And she explained, we sell all these cookies. If everyone just asks for a particular cookie, what are we going to do with the other cookies? We would never be able to sell them. So I understood her point of view.
Well, first of all, it's an example of you getting curious about another person's experience rather than not asking about
Right.
your observation. It's about you being curious. It's about you then asking. And then it's about the possibility of having a little bit or a lot of empathy for the other person. That, like you
Yeah.
said, the operating term that you used earlier is it's an opportunity to learn about other people who have different points of view. And I know that can be really difficult because other people's points of view can be very, very offensive and even threatening, or they can feel threatening. But I like your example because you're saying I didn't feel threatened by asking. I didn't think I was endangering anybody by asking the question. The worst that could have happened is she says, I don't feel like answering you. But she did answer.
But I love this idea of, reframing unfortunate events into opportunity to understand, to learn. So sometimes people say to me, okay, I know I don't feel well. I acknowledge it. It could be PTSD or it could be depression or anxiety. But they say that they don't want to rest. They don't want to take time off from work, even though their therapists or their doctors recommend it, because they're afraid that if they stay home and have nothing to do, they will actually get worse. What do you say to patients who don't want to rest? They just want to keep working and they are afraid that if they get a moment of free time, of resting at home, their medical condition, their psychological condition would get worse?
I think those fears are, as always, anything that a person expresses as something they're concerned about. It's valid. It's legitimate. It's not necessarily true in terms of like that's not necessarily what's going to happen. So I'd first of all want to thoroughly explore what their fears are, what the basis of their fears are, and then get back to balancing out their fears with, and how long do you think this current circumstance is sustainable? I use terms like, something's going to give, and I'd rather you choose to take a leave than it being chosen for you by virtue of not being able to function. And, I don't want to scare people, but, if they're scared about taking time off, I want to point out other dangers and other elements that they should also be focusing on if they're thinking about what they're afraid of. Nobody wants to feel more out of control. And it is more out of control if a person just keeps going and then they experience, on top of their symptoms, the negative consequences of failing, basically not being able to keep up with either their daily responsibilities and or their work responsibilities, being fired or having a partner break up with them because they don't understand and they say you're not engaged anymore, that sort of thing.
If I have a family member or a good friend who, I'm like, okay, he's spiraling down into a crisis. What can I do? How do I bring up the subject with that person?
And here it's a person by person situation because everybody has their styles, and if you know your family member, then you kind of know what would make them feel most comfortable or what they're going to be most kind of self-conscious about. And then also with taking into consideration the backdrop, excuse me, of does this person ever talk about things like this within their family or their culture or whatever it is. But all that said, I think one always leads with empathy in the situation. Not just I'm concerned about you. I think sometimes that can be off-putting even because a person's like, what do you mean you're concerned about me? That can feel sort of distancing in a way. And I know that it's often said with very good intent. But I think it's important can I talk with you about something and then stay with, I've noticed, and then you stick with behavioral observations. I've noticed these things, and I'm wondering if you've noticed them too, or if those things are, or if you're feeling that those things are problematic for you. and just kind of leave it with your observations, and then give them space to have their own kind of description or commentary about what it is that you've observed. And that will also give you a sense of, okay, can we go in deeper? Because they might say, oh, yeah, actually, I have noticed those things. You're the first person who said, something. Or they might just say, oh, yeah, it's no big deal. And they might kind of brush it away. And that gives you the idea of, okay, I don't think this person's ready to have a conversation with me about this. But at least you've planted a seed.
This noticing is empathy. This
It
noticing
is.
is a type of love. So I love this idea of just saying, I notice. It's so practical and so effective.
I think it is. Another term is recognition.
Recognition,
Is
yes.
people want, I mean, sometimes people think of recognition like, oh, you got an award because of your hard work. But recognition can be even much more mundane and just as powerful, which is just simply recognizing, oh, I saw a look on your face. People, I think there's a absolute dearth in our society of people just simply recognizing other people's experience, or at least what they notice about other people's experience.
Yeah. And I think sometimes what people want is just to be recognized and noticed. They don't want to be showered with compliments. They don't want to go into a room and everybody is like, "Oh my God, it's you, so great, you're wonderful," and this and that.
Sometimes we get away from simplicity. We get away from, we think we have to do something fancy or flowery for another person. A
Right.
person with, bringing us back to PTSD, which does, as we were talking about earlier, intersect with racism. The simple act of, I noticed that you looked uncomfortable when we walked into that restaurant. Did something happen?
Right.
Versus like,
Well,
oh my gosh, do you feel like there's racism here? Or, that, like, sometimes we try to like lay it on thick, and that actually ends up feeling more obtrusive to the other person. And it kind of like drowns out their experience, which, as we're talking about, the most important part of which is just that simple recognition or noticing. I noticed something. Do you feel like sharing what happened there?
and that's how we can also show empathy to oneself, right? So I would say, oh, I noticed lately that I feel very uncomfortable when I walk into this shop with that person. What's going on? What's going on with me? Is this some sort of trigger for me? Or I notice that I have been having these dreams and I want to talk to someone about it. And just staying curious, and noticing with that curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
That's empathy. And it's very for
Yes.
oneself.
And it
And
should
I
be
think
applied to
that,
oneself, like you said.
yeah. And that's how I think that we can fight PTSD. Okay, well, thanks so much for being here with us, Lisa. This has been enlightening to me, and I hope to the listeners as well. Any parting words?
Well, you're very welcome, Andy. And I think that our conversation is an example of how a person who's not even in the mental health field can have co-generate really important ideas together that could be really helpful to other people. So thank you for having this conversation with me. I feel like I learned a lot too.
We'll do it again.
All right.
Thank you.